Hello, this is Josh Robinson with Checkmate. Thank you everybody for dialing in for today's webinar. Today's webinar is going to be focused on preparing for a return to normalcy. There's a number of items that we're going to cover, including doing a risk assessment on your organization in preparation for the return of your employees to the office. And a number of other related topics. So I am going to actually start showing my screen. And which screen am I showing? Show me. Okay, good. There we go. All right, so there is a Q&A or questions panel that you guys can all submit questions through, and there will be time for Q&A at the end. This webinar is going to last approximately the next 30 to 40 minutes of content, and then there'll be time for some questions and answers at the end. So with that said, bring up my presentation. And now I need to show my other screen. Okay, good. Okay, so basically the presentation is pretty cut and dried. Everyone should be able to see my PowerPoint now. If anybody has any trouble at all, there is a chat panel that you can put a message into, which I can see while I'm giving the presentation. So please don't hesitate if anybody has any trouble hearing my voice, if the if the quality of the call starts to fade or anything like that. I believe everything should be in order here, but just let me know if there are any problems. All right, so diving in the context of the return to normalcy, there's a number of items that need to be considered here. The first of which is that there is no return to normalcy. The fact of the matter is that while people are talking about opening back up, and I'm eager for that to happen, just as anyone is. The reality that we're coming back to is a reality where coronavirus is a clear and present danger to our organizations, and that is not going to go away for a long time. Even if we have a vaccine in a year and a half, we won't be in a position where we can manage our organizations as if coronavirus weren't a clear and present danger to our businesses until all of us are vaccinated. And that's going to be a significant amount of time after the vaccine is created. So it's really important that we make sure that the plans that we put in place and the plans that we execute on here have taken into account everything that we need to create a safe workspace for our employees and to minimize the risk to our businesses. So there's a few key things I'm going to cover in this webinar. The first is going to start with the conducting of a risk assessment, and then I'm going to go over a number of items for consideration in regard to rehiring or reactivating your employees and bringing remote workers back. And then finally, we're going to do an overview of your responsibilities as an employer for maintaining workplace safety, and then we'll get into Q&A at the end. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be going through a number of resources here, template letters, model letters, things of that nature. Following this presentation, everybody who is on the webinar will get a copy of the presentation, the PowerPoint, and a copy of all of the supporting documents. They will also all be posted up on our COVID-19 resource page on our website. And there will be a recording of this webinar that's made available to everyone as well. All right, so firstly, conducting a risk assessment. So here we are. I was doing this over this past weekend for Checkmate. Here we are in a world where there's now talk about opening things back up. And many of you have organizations that were either mandatorily shut down by the governor or hold on, or you have organizations where you, in some cases, voluntarily shut down your organizations because of the nature of your business. Why is I just lost all of I'm sorry, guys. My computer is going haywire on me here somehow. For some reason, I've lost my ability to move my mouse across my monitors. All right, well, I'm going to try to continue. We'll see if this works. Nope, it's not working. Okay. Hold on, guys. I apologize. Give me just a minute. See if I can't fix this. Thank you. Finally. Okay, I guess I'll just change things around and show you the screen. Oh, it's just completely disregarded that my other screens exist. Okay, sorry guys. I think we're back in business now. Hopefully. Okay. Perfect. Good. Okay. Now back to my presentation. Conducting a risk assessment. Okay. So the main things that you need to really think about here. And there's a science to doing risk assessments generally, but this is really, kind of what I was thinking through for Checkmate this past weekend. So in the context of getting back to business here, identifying the hazards. What are the hazards that we're talking about? Well, we need to think about the exposures that simply being back in your place of business might have, particularly if an infected person enters your facility. What are all of the risks that need to be considered in regard to that? What do you have employees that have frequent and regular interaction with customers where they are oftentimes going to be within 6 feet of each other? Do you have whereas Checkmate at our business our biggest risk is not related to people who are not part of our company coming into the office. Our biggest risk is our own employees. There's a second biggest risk that I was able to figure for us, which is going to be the exposure that we have with UPS or FedEx stopping by to pick up packages and delivering packages. But the biggest risk in my company is going to be the risk that any one of us could come into the workspace with COVID-19 and infect everybody else. But every one of us is going to have a different type of hazard, kind of situation that we need to be concerned about. And it's also important to consider what tasks the employees are performing and whether or not those tasks themselves are going to likely create COVID-19 risks or exposures. For instance, if there's any instances where your staff are out in the field and they are going to, different customer locations or things of that nature, that is more or less a constant exposure to a COVID threat that they would be, facing. So, you need to assess those risks, identify all of the hazards that your particular organization comes with that need consideration so that you can strategize around and minimize the COVID-related risks. On that note, there's now just recently been topics or a conversation happening at the federal level that some of you may have heard about so far in regard to corporate liability as things start to reopen again. I would suggest that everybody pay close attention to what's being discussed at the federal level in regard to corporate liability. By all appearances, I suspect that there will be some either legislation that is uniquely focused on this, or perhaps that is incorporated into the next, coronavirus-related federal legislation. About that, but it is something. It's something that deserves consideration now. Because they're starting to talk about it. I would suggest that you keep your eyes on it, because right now, you have an obligation as an employer to provide a safe workspace for your employees, and without any special conditions, in law, that would avoid liabilities around that for employers. There is definitely a significant chance for lawsuits, by employees against employers, for unnecessary COVID-19 exposures, things of that nature. Which right now is why it makes sense for us to now start considering and doing whatever we can to prepare best practice solutions for minimizing that exposure, so that as soon as employees come back into the workspace, they can get an experience where they are seeing, significant emphasis being placed by you as the employer on all of the ways in which you're doing things to minimize that risk. So the next item in a risk assessment is who is at risk. So who are the people that are going to be harmed, and how? Again, you need to think about what kind of populations comprise your workforce. And you need to make note of high-risk individuals. High-risk individuals are staff members who meet with customers or who are on the road and, frequently, coming back into the workspace, from the road, or individuals with pre-existing medical conditions that happen to make them a higher risk type of employee when it comes to COVID-19. So additionally, once you've identified what your possible hazards are and who your at-risk populations are, it then makes sense for us to sit back and say, okay, well, of all of these things that could go wrong, what's most likely to occur, and what are the impacts? Now, when I ask these two questions, you have to ask these two questions on every single item that you have identified as a hazard or an at-risk population. Both questions need to be answered. So, for instance, when you do a risk assessment that's beyond COVID-19 for a business continuity plan, well, in Checkmate's business continuity plan, one of the risks that we've identified, or at least we did when we originally built it, was a meltdown at the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. Now the power plant is shut down, so it's not the same risk as it used to be. But we are in the fallout path of the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant, which means that it's not very likely to occur. So when we rated it on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it to occur? It was a 1. But the impact, if it does occur, was a 5, which is on a scale of 1 to 5. So you need to identify the likelihood of the risk and the impact that risk would have to your company. So, for instance, when I was working on this for Checkmate, it occurred to me that, it doesn't really matter when the state decides to open up. None of it matters. The only thing that matters to me in regard to when I am going to be comfortable having every one of my employees back in our workspace is when we are all vaccinated. Because one of the biggest, while it might not be super likely, one of the biggest threats to my company is the chance that any one of us could infect the rest of us with COVID-19, which means that I cannot afford to have every employee in my building at once. It also means there's a number of other things that I need to consider, and I'll get into that, a little further into the presentation. But I just want you guys to pick up on, what are the chances? I actually think the chances of one of us coming into this office with COVID-19 are fairly high. I think that I put that as a 3 or 4. No, I'm sorry, a 7 or 8 on the likelihood to occur, and of course the impact is a 5. So I need to make all of my planning based around the risk that any one of my staff could infect the rest of us. That needs to be a driving factor in all of the decisions that I make leading up to inviting people back into the workspace. So I highly suggest that you guys, consider a risk assessment, and then controlling risks. There's three ways to potentially control the risks once you know what they are, how likely they are to occur, and what their impacts are. So one is risk avoidance. So I just described to you how, one of my ideas was, well, you know what? I'm only going to invite certain people back into my office, at least until we're all vaccinated. By not permitting people in my office, I'm using risk avoidance as a tactic there, as opposed to risk control. So risk control is folks who I have to allow back in my office and putting in whatever preventative measures I can to avoid the potential spread of COVID-19 among my staff. So risk control would be, regularly disinfecting and cleaning the workspace, having everybody wipe down their workstations at the end of the day, et cetera, et cetera. And then risk transfer, which really isn't much of an option in this case, would usually be situations where you actually, offload your exposure by introducing a third party, and to some extent, I suppose, hiring a cleaning service is a way of transferring the risk of actually having any of your staff exposed to, touching the surface that has COVID-19 on it potentially, by having the cleaning crew do it instead. So control measures for COVID-19 would need to include, cleaning protocols. Right now we have, every week we have our cleaners come in, but it's not a policy. It's not something I've defined in our employee handbook or anything like that, but it will be soon. Work from home orders and mandated personal protective equipment usage. Those are all control measures and additional workspace considerations, that I'll cover a little further into the presentation. And then, monitoring for results isn't really, something that I think is going to need a lot of special attention because, of course, it is. Monitoring for results in the context of your risk assessment would compel you to do things such as taking everybody's temperature when they come in the building at the beginning of the day, and it would also be, might involve your regularly inquiring about COVID-related symptoms among anybody who is coming into the office. So next order of business here is in regard to maintaining workplace safety using OSHA and CDC guidance. So you have an obligation to be maintaining a safe work environment, and this is where the liability stuff comes in. I expect that we're going to see some rules, some legislation passed that will, in some way, shape, or form, absolve employers who are otherwise using, certain best practices from lawsuits by employees where they are placing you at fault for their catching COVID-19. But it is something that it's vitally important that everybody understands that you have this obligation and be proactive about what you are doing because you have this obligation, and communicate actively and openly with your staff about this. And by this, the maintenance of your workplace safety, this really will compel you in many ways to create policies where you didn't used to need or have policies. And also, it will compel you to acquire some supplies that you previously haven't needed to, maintain and things of that nature. So, implementing administrative controls are changes to work policies or procedures to minimize the individual's exposure to a hazard. So, for instance, instead of perhaps using the universal rule that I described, I was thinking about doing for Checkmate, you might implement an administrative control where you establish alternating work days or extra shifts to reduce the total number of employees in the facility at any given time. Or you might do that in the context of, managing the on-site workforce such that you always have enough space for people to maintain social distancing. Therefore, others would work from home. So you need a policy around that, and you need to embed that in your employee handbook. Eventually, that probably would be the best idea. Initially, it could be a standalone policy, but I would suggest that these things, again, COVID-19, we have at least 2 years, if not more, before this will not be a real and present danger in our businesses. So we need to, when we're creating these policies, we really need to consider whether or not we need to incorporate them into the handbook. And I would say that more often than not, you should justify the rationale why you don't have to include it in your handbook as opposed to the alternative. The next one, and this one is a new and interesting need here, but most of us need to obtain and utilize personal protective equipment now. Right now, we have a vendor that we work with through which we are providing our customers with a storefront to buy coronavirus prevention and awareness equipment, first aid kits and things of that nature. I am going to make sure over time here that I have a supply for my company of surgical masks, that I have a supply for my company of anything else that I can think of that I might need, in order to make sure that we can operate this company with people on site, and have everybody, using best practices for personal protective equipment and things of that nature. Most organizations, have a bit more customer-facing aspects to them, but I would highly recommend. Right now, whenever I walk into a grocery store, whenever I walk into any of the places of business that are still open, I have my face mask on, and it blows my mind that the people that work there do not. If you employ people who have a retail, facing job, or if you employ people who regularly interact with customers, you are creating a dangerous situation by not having your employee using their own personal protective equipment, and you cannot expect your employees to obtain their own PPE. You need to supply that PPE in order for them to use it. Otherwise, you can't expect them to have or use it. I am going to be acquiring, as soon as I can, a supply basically through our vendor, which is a company called OSHA for Less. We will be able to. They are preparing what they're calling a coronavirus prevention kits that will come with a set of masks. I believe they're also going to have a set of disposable thermometers. Right now, I'm looking at what the best device to use for thermometers is, and whether or not we're in a position to be able to make those acquiring those devices something that you can do through Checkmate as well. But the personal protective equipment, again, is just a new thing that we've never really had to give much consideration to. But we are now in a world where these things need to be considered. I feel, if I haven't given every one of my staff a face mask to use, I can't expect that they're using a face mask whenever they're not on site. But if I do give them a face mask, if I am in a position to do that, then I could at least hopefully expect that they will all wear face masks when they're not here, and hopefully by doing that, minimize the chance that any of them will bring COVID-19 into my office. So the engineering controls, this is a little bit more, it's more on the physical side, where administrative controls is on the policy side. So, considering the installation of high efficiency air filters, increasing ventilation rates in the work environments, installing physical barriers. For instance, if you were in the food service, and you installed sneeze guards, plastic sneeze guards, things of that nature. So encouraging and mandating social distancing, I don't think that even when they start to relax the rules, again, if I can't make sure that everybody in my workspace stays at least 6 feet apart, then I can't invite them back into my workspace. That's at least the philosophy that I'm using. And separating sick employees is vitally important here. Employees who appear to have symptoms upon arrival or who become sick during the day should immediately be separated from employees, customers, and visitors and sent home. And there is, some guidance that I have a little bit further in the presentation about how to handle situations where, one of your staff is sick like this or has COVID-19. And then there's, supporting respiratory etiquette and hand hygiene. Again, things that we haven't previously had to consider, but providing tissues and no-touch disposal receptacles, providing soap and water in the workplace, providing hand sanitizer in multiple locations to encourage hand hygiene. These are all things that we now need to consider doing, and in my, as far as I'm concerned, I consider it to be necessary. If I don't have these things in place, then again, I can't invite back anything beyond my skeleton crew that's still here in the office. And then finally, right now, for this section of our presentation, performing routine environmental cleaning and disinfection. And this is another flavor of things that we haven't had to have as front of mind in most of our businesses up until now. The disinfection of my office space is not something that I have ever had to give a huge amount of consideration to. But now I need to talk to our cleaners about making sure that we do periodically, fully disinfect the entire space. And it is something that along those lines, we also, there's a compelling reason now to discourage workers from using other workers' phones, desks, offices, or other tools and equipment. Or if they have to, they need to wipe them down before they start to use them, and they need to wipe them down after they're done. So just some things that really need to be considered. So actually just going to expand this whole slide first. All right. So now that I've gone through all that, now we're rehiring or reactivating our employees. So how do we do that? So firstly, we have a template letter that we'll be providing for you guys. That's simply a template letter to use for all of the staff in regard to your return to work. And it's simply, is a place to document basically all of the things I just described that you're now doing differently. So that everybody, understands what's going on, understands that the organization is taking this very seriously, and alleviates, some of the concern that they might have in the absence of a letter like this. Then we also have, those employees that we need to deal with who we furloughed, if we did furlough anyone. Now, employees that you laid off, you need to go through the hiring process again. That's just how it works. They're terminated. They're no longer on your payroll. So you need to provide them with a new offer letter. You need to provide them with, a statement of their rate of pay. You need to get them to go through the motions of, providing their direct deposit details, et cetera, et cetera. It is not reasonable or appropriate, to assume that the rehired employee who was laid off is going to use exactly the same tax withholding settings that they had before, or use the exact same bank account routing number and account number that they did before. You should, in most cases, treat them like newly hired employees. Furloughs, on the other hand, can be handled differently. So we have a sample letter for furloughed employees. which basically just describes that this new offer letter, which is what this furlough letter serves as, supersedes previous offer letters. It states all of the details about their pay, and then it specifies things like your seniority will not be affected, your benefits will be restored without condition. But you guys should modify this to state what you need it to state to be accurate for your organization, and I think I've now kind of run over our time here, so I'm going to cruise through the rest of this really quickly. So there's that letter for the furloughed employees. A couple of items to consider for the furloughed folks. They have never been truly terminated, okay? So when we bring them back, are we going to collect the cost of the benefits that have still been enforced for all this time while they've been, taking an unpaid furlough? Are we going to require the employee to pay that accrued liability amount over time to make up for what they didn't contribute while they weren't working? Or are we going to eat that cost? And should we require new direct deposit info to be submitted, et cetera, et cetera? We have a return to work checklist, which will be provided to everybody on this webinar as well, which basically just walks you through a whole bunch of things that you need to do or be concerned about. I can't emphasize enough. Please, please, please. Everybody needs to display the FFCRA, your rights under the FFCRA compliance poster for all of your employees. In fact, I would also recommend that you email it to everyone. All of your employees have a right to be aware of what they are entitled to under the FFCRA. And I've been very surprised by the number of employers out there, not necessarily our customers, but the number of employers out there that I'm aware of, where their employees are completely clueless. I've talked to a number of friends who are stuck working from home, taking care of their kids, who have no awareness of the fact that they actually should be allowed by their employer to not work and take 2/3 of their pay to take care of their kids. So this checklist really walks you through a lot of the nuts and bolts of what you need to be concerned about, what you need to give some consideration to, what you need to do that was either already discussed in this webinar or perhaps things that I haven't actually gotten into in detail. So that will be provided to everybody who's on the webinar here. So now we have some FAQs that will also be here on the webinar that I'm just going to zoom through really quickly because the questions and answers are all thoroughly documented right in these slides. So basically, just can employees refuse to travel? Can we send employees home if they're symptomatic? What if my employee discloses, that their family member or roommate has COVID, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a lot of good material here for the FAQs. And please, if you guys review these and if you have follow-up questions, you can please send those questions to covid19@checkmatepayroll.com. Next item is everybody on the webinar is going to have, we've obtained 50 sets of these posters for coronavirus awareness and prevention and steps to take at work. So everybody on the webinar is going to get a copy. These are 2 laminated posters that you'll get from us. We will ship to you here later this week. And you get 1 set at no cost. If you need more, then you have our OSHA storefront that can be used to buy more. So here on this resources page, we have the sample communication to employees if you get somebody with COVID-19 in the workplace, which is also provided as a resource for this presentation. Then we have Checkmate's overall COVID-19 employer general reference page. This is where we're posting all of our FAQs, all of our webinars, all of the other material that we're obtaining and linking to so that you have one central place to get all of your COVID-19 related information. And then finally here we have the OSHA storefront. There's a link to this on our website as well. And when you're buying things from the store, if you use the code COV50, then everything that you buy here will be 50% off. In addition to the posters, you also can buy the OSHA guidance on preparing workplaces for COVID-19, the CDC Get Your Workplace Ready for Pandemic Flu guide, which is also very useful for the prevention, implementing policies for prevention as well. So that all said, I know I'm over time, guys. I appreciate it, people staying on later. I do want to do some Q&A, but unfortunately, I no longer have control of the panel in my meeting. Oh, there it is. Okay, hold on. Okay, so I just want to see if we have any questions. Nope, there's no questions that have been submitted so far, and there's nothing in chat. I am going to unmute everyone in case anybody has anything that they want to ask about. So give me 1 second here, and I'll have everybody unmuted.